The town doctor confessed that the victim was still alive, and that he was forced to watch as a man in a tailored suit calmly smothered him to death. This was the secret, a desperate widow, heavy with child, now carried, a secret that could burn the entire valley to the ground. She collapses at the feet of the only man strong enough to protect her, not knowing his single act of kindness will ignite a brutal war, pitting one good man's honor against the power of an entire empire. The Oregon forest in a downpour was a special kind of hell, a black-drenched world where ancient firs wept a cold, endless rain. For Eleanor Vance, each ragged breath was a battle, each step a victory against the sucking mire that fought to claim her worn leather shoes. The weight in her belly, the precious, kicking life she'd sworn to protect, was an anchor of both purpose and pain, pulling her down even as it willed her to go on. She stumbled, catching herself against the rough bark of a cedar, its scent of earth and eternity, a cruel reminder of a world that would go on long after she was gone. Her husband Arthur's face swam in her memory, not as he was in life, smiling, his eyes full of earnest belief in the law, but as he was in his last moments. A sharp crack that wasn't thunder, and the surprised look on his face before he fell. Behind that memory was a name, a curse whispered in the dark corners of the logging towns. Silas Blackwood. It was his men who had done it, his ambition that had orphaned her child before it was even born. And it was his men who were still out there, shadows moving through the trees, their presence a cold knot of dread in her gut. She clutched the small, oilskin-wrapped package tucked inside her coat, the film, the notebook, the truth that had cost Arthur everything. Her body was failing. A sharp, searing pain stitched her side, and her vision began to blur at the edges. The relentless cold had seeped into her bones, a deep, invasive chill that no amount of running could warm. Just to the next rise, she told herself, the same lie she'd been repeating for the last hour. But there was no rise, only more trees, more darkness, more rain. Her legs buckled without warning, sending her sprawling into the mud. For a moment, she lay there, the fight draining out of her like blood from a wound. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. Then came the sound. It started as a low growl, vibrating through the wet earth, deeper than any thunder. It grew steadily into a mechanical roar, an unnatural beast tearing through the sacred silence of the woods. A light appeared, two piercing beams that cut through the downpour, freezing her in place like a startled doe. It was a truck, its engine grinding as it navigated the treacherous logging road. For a heartbeat, terror seized her. They had found her. The roaring engine, the blinding lights, it was a monster come to swallow her whole. With the last of her strength, she tried to crawl, to pull herself back into the shadows. But it was no use. The roar became a screech of tortured metal as the truck slammed on its brakes, its massive form sliding to a halt just yards away. The world tilted, the twin lights dissolving into a blinding white glare, and Eleanor Vance knew no more. The engine of the Ford truck idled with a low, patient rumble as a man emerged, his sheer size seeming to dwarf the ancient trees around him. Liam O'Connell moved with the quiet deliberation of a man who wrestled with giants, both of timber and of memory. The rain slicked back his dark hair and ran in rivulets down his weathered face, but he paid it no mind. Trouble was a constant companion on these lonely logging roads, and his first instinct was caution. He approached the crumpled form in the mud, his hand resting near the butt of the hunting rifle he kept slung behind his seat. Then he saw her, not just a woman, but one heavy with child, her face pale as birch bark in the glare of the headlights. And in that instant, the cold caution in Liam's gut was consumed by a fire he hadn't felt in years. The smell of rain and wet earth was suddenly replaced by the scent of pine smoke and ash. He saw another fire, a terrible one from a decade past that had devoured his home, his life. He saw his Sarah, her hand reaching for him through the flames, and he heard the faint cry of his little Lily, A ghost of a pain, sharp and familiar, twisted inside him. He had been helpless then, a giant who could fell a forest but couldn't save his own family. There was no decision to be made. His body acted on an instinct older than grief. He knelt, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed the wet hair from the woman's face. She was burning with fever. "Not your trouble, O'Connell," a voice in his head warned, the same voice that had kept him safe and alone for 10 years. He ignored it. With a grunt, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. Her head lolled against his chest, her fragile form lost in the bulk of his canvas coat. He carried her back to the truck, laying her carefully on the bench seat and covering her with a rough wool blanket from behind the seat. He drove through the night, the truck's tires churning a path toward the only place in the valley that Silas Blackwood's shadow didn't touch. His ranch house appeared over a rise, not a grand mansion, but a fortress of timber and stone, its windows glowing with a warm, defiant light. He carried her up the wide porch steps, the solid wood groaning under his weight. With his shoulder, he nudged the heavy oak door open. The chaos of the storm was shut out, replaced by the scent of burning logs and brewing coffee. For the first time that night, the woman in his arms was safe. But Liam knew that by bringing her in, he had just invited the storm inside. Eleanor woke to a world of warmth and quiet. The scent of cedar and lavender replaced the memory of cold mud, and the heavy weight on her was not despair, but a thick down quilt. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth across the room, casting dancing shadows on the timber walls. Her first conscious act was a panicked flutter of her hand to her belly. The child was safe, moving with a faint, reassuring kick. She was in a bed, in a solid, well-built room that felt like the heart of a fortress. But whether it was a sanctuary or a prison, she did not yet know. The door opened and a woman entered, carrying a tray. She was older, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes held a practical kindness. "You're awake. Good. Don't try to talk too much. Just drink this." She offered a steaming mug of broth, her movements efficient and sure. "I'm Martha. You're at the O'Connell logging ranch. The master brought you in last night." The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but the word master sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Later, the master himself appeared, his frame filling the doorway and blocking out the light. Liam O'Connell said nothing at first, his gaze steady and unreadable as he looked at her. He had the quiet intensity of a man who spent more time listening to the forest than to people. "You were running," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Eleanor's throat was dry. "There was an accident. My wagon overturned." The lie felt thin and brittle in the small room. His eyes narrowed slightly, acknowledging the lie without challenging it. "Rest," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Martha will see to you." Then he was gone, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken questions. In his study, a room paneled with the same dark, fragrant cedar, Liam held the small, mud-stained lady's purse he'd found near her on the road. A man of honor didn't pry into a woman's belongings, but a man of sense didn't ignore a threat brought to his own front door. He opened the clasp. Inside, amongst a few damp dollar bills and a handkerchief, was a leather billfold. He pulled it out. The name on the identification card made the air in his lungs turn to ice. Arthur Vance, Federal Auditor, Department of the Treasury. Liam stared at the small, official photograph of the smiling man. Auditors didn't have accidents in this part of Oregon. They came looking for trouble, and in Silas Blackwood's territory, they always found it. He now understood. This woman wasn't a victim of misfortune. She was a survivor of a war, and she had just carried its banner right through his door. A day passed in a quiet, watchful truce. Eleanor had regained some strength, enough to sit by the fire while Martha mended her torn dress. The house was a bubble of impossible peace, a world away from the hunt she knew was still raging outside. The fragile calm was shattered by the sound of a sputtering engine coming up the main track, a sound too light and nervous for a logging truck. Martha's hands stilled, her lips tightening into a thin, hard line. "Trouble," she murmured, and the single word was enough to make Eleanor's blood run cold. The man who stepped onto the porch wore the uniform of a deputy sheriff, but he wore it like a costume. He was wiry and thin-lipped, a tin star pinned crookedly to his chest, and a smirk that didn't reach his cold, restless eyes. This was Deputy Hatcher, a man whose loyalty belonged not to the law, but to the deep pockets of Silas Blackwood. Liam met him on the porch, his large frame blocking the doorway completely. Hatcher had to crane his neck to look up at him. "O'Connell," Hatcher began, his voice laced with false authority. "Been reports of a thief up this way. A woman. Thought I'd check your camps." Liam didn't move. "My men are honest. You know that, Hatcher. People get desperate," the deputy shot back, his eyes flicking past Liam, trying to peer into the house. "Heard you had company. A sick relative, maybe?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as an axe. Eleanor, listening from the shadows of the main room, felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "My house is my own," Liam said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "You've got no business here without a warrant." Hatcher's smirk widened. "A warrant? Now why would I need a warrant between friends? Unless you've got something to hide." He took a step forward, trying to push past. Liam didn't raise a hand. He simply shifted his weight, a subtle movement that turned him into a wall of solid muscle and bone. Hatcher stopped dead. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. The deputy saw something in Liam's eyes, the flat, dead calm of a man who had already lost everything that mattered, and the last of his bluster evaporated. He took a step back, his hand hovering nervously near his pistol. "Blackwood won't like this," he spat. "He hears about everything." "I'm counting on it," Liam replied, his voice a low promise of violence. He watched until Hatcher's car had disappeared down the track, the sound of its angry engine swallowed by the forest. He turned and found Eleanor standing in the hall, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. The pretense of the accident was gone, burned away by the deputy's visit. He knew, and she knew that he knew. In the heavy silence that followed, a silent pact was sealed. This was no longer just his house. It was their fortress, and the war had just been declared on their doorstep. That night the house settled into a heavy silence, but peace was a luxury neither of them could afford. Liam was in his study, staring into the dying embers of the fire, when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was holding the small, oilskin-wrapped package he'd seen her clutch before. Her face was pale in the firelight, but her eyes held a new, hard resolve. The time for lies was over. "My husband's name was Arthur," she began, her voice low but steady. "He wasn't in an accident, Mr. O'Connell. He was murdered." She walked to his massive oak desk and carefully laid the package upon it. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the layers of waterproof cloth, revealing a small leather-bound notebook and a single cold canister of film. Silas Blackwood killed him because he found this. Liam picked up the notebook. He opened it to a page filled with Arthur Vance's neat, precise handwriting. At first it was just numbers, shipment manifests, timber yields, payroll discrepancies. It was the cold arithmetic of theft. But then he turned a page and saw a list of names under the heading Workplace Fatalities. His breath caught in his chest. He knew these names. Jake Miller, a good man from a neighboring camp, supposedly killed by a falling branch. Ben Carter, a choker setter who'd been crushed when a cable snapped. The official reports had called them tragic accidents. Arthur's notes called them murder, with dates and payments listed next to each name. A cold, dark rage began to build in Liam, a fury deeper than anything he had felt since the night of the fire. This wasn't just about stolen trees or corporate greed. This was a ledger of men, men with families, men who had worked this hard land honestly, erased from the world for profit. He looked up at Eleanor, his knuckles white as he gripped the notebook. "The film?" he asked, his voice a harsh whisper. "Proof," she said, her own voice breaking slightly. "Arthur said the numbers weren't enough. He took pictures of the men who arranged the accidents, pictures of the illegal logging sites they were trying to hide. It's all in there." Liam looked from the notebook in his hand to the canister on his desk. That small metal tube was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a testament, a ghost, and it was a death warrant for anyone who possessed it. He understood now. By giving him her secret, Eleanor had given him the lives of every man who worked for him, the very soul of the community he had built. He was no longer just protecting a woman. He was standing guard over the truth itself. The notebook and the film canister lay on the desk between them, a silent testament to the war they had inherited. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the quiet of the house was now a shared space, not an empty one. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence, her voice soft in the dim light. "You live in this big house all by yourself, Mr. O'Connell." For the first time, she had called him by his name, not his title. Liam stared into the embers, his broad shoulders slumping for a moment under a weight far heavier than timber. "I wasn't always alone," he said, the words rough, as if pulled from a deep and dusty place. He didn't look at her, but at the empty rocking chair in the corner, a ghost in the shadows. "I had a family, a wife, Sarah, and a little girl. Her name was Lily." He spoke the names like prayers he had long since forgotten, tasting them on his tongue for the first time in years. Eleanor waited, knowing this was a sacred ground she had stumbled upon. "What happened?" she whispered. "Fire," he said, the single word sharp as broken glass. 10 years ago. It was a dry summer. The wind was blowing hard from the east. A spark from the old mill caught the kindling. I was down there with the men, fighting it, trying to save the lumber yard. A muscle worked in his jaw. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were a raw landscape of guilt and old pain. "We saved the mill," he said, his voice thick with a terrible irony. "I spent all night saving my business, but I wasn't here. The wind changed, and I wasn't here to carry them out." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. Eleanor saw it all then, the solitude, the quiet sadness, the reason a man would build a fortress around his heart. He wasn't just a giant of a man. He was a monument to a loss she was only just beginning to understand. Her own grief felt less lonely in the presence of his. Without thinking, she reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his arm. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was enough. Liam flinched at the contact, then stilled, accepting the warmth. He didn't pull away. In the quiet of the study, two solitary survivors of different fires found a moment of shared understanding. The bond between them was no longer just about protection. It was now forged in the ashes of a shared sorrow. The days that followed were quiet, but it was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a coming storm. The attack, when it came, wasn't with fists or bullets, but with the silent, crushing weight of commerce. It began with a telegram from a mill in Portland, cancelling a contract that had stood for 15 years. Then a rail shipment of vital machine parts was mysteriously rerouted, lost somewhere in Silas Blackwood's sprawling network of tracks. The logging camps fell silent, the great saws idle, the men standing in worried clusters, their hands empty. Liam stood in his office, the ledgers on his desk telling a story of slow strangulation. His foreman, Marcus, a man whose loyalty Liam had trusted more than his own right hand, entered without knocking. His face, normally weathered and cheerful, was a mask of grey stone. "The crew is getting restless, Liam," Marcus said, his voice flat. "No work means no pay. They've got families." "I know, Marcus," Liam replied, his gaze fixed on the accounts. "This is Blackwood's doing. He's trying to starve us out." But Liam saw something else in his friend's eyes, a fear that went deeper than just business. It was personal. "What is it?" Liam asked, his voice softening. "What aren't you telling me?" Marcus stared at the floor, his big hands clenching and unclenching. "It's my boy, Liam. My Leo." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a helpless shame. "He took a job at the Blackwood rail yard a few months back. Better money," he said. He took a ragged breath. Blackwood sent a message. He knows the boy got into some trouble, some gambling debt. Blackwood says he can make it all go away. He just wants information about you, about her. The air went still. Liam felt the betrayal like a physical blow, not from Marcus, but from the calculated cruelty of the man who would turn a father's love for his son into a weapon. He saw the impossible choice Silas was forcing upon his most trusted man: betray your friend or sacrifice your child. Liam walked over and placed a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Go home, Marcus. Be with your son." His voice was quiet, but held the unbending strength of an old-growth fir. "But you tell him this. A man can't stand in two canoes at once. Sooner or later, he has to choose which one won't sink." Marcus nodded, his face a ruin of conflict, and left Liam alone in the quiet office. The squeeze was on. Blackwood was no longer just attacking his business. He was coming for the loyalty of his men, trying to tear his fortress down from the inside out. When the economic pressure failed to break him, Liam O'Connell did what he always did. He went to work. He reopened a small logging site on a ridge close to the main house, a strategic move to keep his best men busy and their spirits from breaking. From the porch, Eleanor watched them, the distant ring of axes a defiant heartbeat in the quiet valley. She saw Marcus's son, Leo, working with the crew, a boy trying to sweat out his father's impossible choice. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was a day that felt safe. It was a lie. The explosion was a deep, guttural boom that rolled down the mountainside, less a sound and more a punch to the chest. It wasn't dynamite from the quarry. It was higher, closer. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. Then the ground trembled. High on the ridge above the logging camp, a plume of smoke and dust blossomed, and the world dissolved into a deafening roar. A section of the hillside, weakened by the blast, gave way. Ancient firs, titans that had stood for centuries, snapped like twigs as tons of rock, dirt, and timber came crashing down toward the camp. Panic erupted below. Men scattered like ants, shouting warnings that were swallowed by the avalanche's roar. But while his men ran for their lives, Liam ran toward the chaos. His voice, louder than the noise of the forest, bellowed orders, pointing men toward the safety of a rocky outcrop. His eyes scanned the destruction, and then he saw them. A handful of younger workers, Leo among them, were trapped behind a fallen pine, its massive trunk blocking their only escape as the main slide thundered directly toward them. He didn't hesitate. He reached the log, a beast of a tree that would take a full crew to move, and plunged his hands beneath it. With a roar of his own that seemed to challenge the mountain itself, Liam heaved. Veins stood out on his neck, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching into knots of granite. The log lifted, just a few precious inches, but it was enough. "Go, now!" he yelled. The terrified young men scrambled out from under it. Leo was the last one, stumbling free just as Liam's strength gave out. The log crashed down an instant before the full force of the landslide obliterated the spot where they had been trapped. When the dust began to settle, Liam stood amidst the wreckage, a giant covered in grime, his chest heaving. He found Leo sitting on the ground, shaking but unharmed. "You all right, son?" Liam asked, his voice raspy. Leo could only nod, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. From the porch, Eleanor lowered the binoculars she'd grabbed, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She had seen the quiet strength of this man. Now she had seen his fury, and she finally understood that Silas Blackwood wasn't just trying to ruin him. He was trying to bury him. The rain returned a few nights later, a steady, mournful drum against the windows of the great house. It was late when a timid, frantic knocking echoed from the front door. Liam opened it to find Dr. Finn, the town's physician, standing drenched and shaking on his porch. The old doctor's face was pale and puffy, and he smelled of cheap whiskey and a deeper, more profound decay, the rot of a guilty conscience. Liam brought him into the study where Eleanor was sitting, a book lying forgotten in her lap. She stiffened at the sight of the doctor, another face from the life that had been stolen from her. "I can't carry it any more, O'Connell," Finn began, without preamble, his voice a ragged whisper. He wrung his hands, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting Blackwood's ghosts to emerge from the shadows. "The federal man, Vance, his death certificate, I signed it. It was a lie. Blackwood made me." This confession, while damning, was not a surprise. Liam merely nodded, his face impassive, waiting for the rest. He knew there was more. The doctor's composure finally broke. He sank into a chair, his body trembling. "They brought him to my clinic after he fell from the railroad trestle, but he wasn't dead, O'Connell. God forgive me. He was still alive." Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Finn looked at her, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. His eyes were open. He was trying to say something. The doctor's voice dropped, thick with horror. "One of Blackwood's men, a quiet man in a tailored suit. He saw it too. He just smiled." He walked over, picked up a pillow from the examination bed, and held it over your husband's face until he stopped moving. The room fell into a dead, horrifying silence, broken only by Eleanor's ragged sob. The clinical, casual brutality of the act was more chilling than any landslide. "What did he try to say?" she whispered, her voice raw with pain. "His last words. What were they?" Dr. Finn shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't make it out. It was just a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm a coward and a drunk, and I let him die." He buried his face in his hands. Liam stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable, but a terrible stillness had settled over him. This was no longer about protecting evidence. It was no longer about a fight for land or livelihood. It was about a good man who had been executed while a coward watched. The fight had just become a reckoning. Dr. Finn's confession had changed everything. The possibility of waiting, of hiding until Blackwood's hunt lost its steam, was gone. They were no longer just harboring a fugitive. They were sheltering the key witness to a cold-blooded execution. In the grim light of morning, Liam and Eleanor sat in the study, the air thick with the unspoken truth. This fortress could not hold forever. They had to move. They had to act. "Portland," Eleanor said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Before Arthur left, he made me memorize a name. Governor Stevenson. He said if the worst happened, I wasn't to trust anyone in this valley. I was to go straight to Stevenson." The name gave their desperate situation a destination, a single point of light in the suffocating darkness. Hope, however faint, had a name. Liam unrolled a large survey map of the county across his desk. With a thick finger, he traced the boundaries of their prison. "Here's the problem," he said, his voice flat. "We're in a box. There's one road south, one road north. Blackwood will have men watching both. That leaves the railroad." He tapped the thick black line that cut through the valley, a scar on the paper landscape. "And the railroad belongs to Silas Blackwood. Every station master, every engineer, every brakeman is on his payroll. Getting on a passenger train is a death sentence." The hope flickered, nearly extinguished by the brutal logic of their geography. They were trapped. Liam stared at the map for a long moment, then looked up. "Get Marcus," he said. When the foreman arrived, his face was etched with a new, fierce loyalty. Liam laid out the situation, omitting no detail. He didn't ask for help. He simply stated the facts. Marcus listened, then nodded once, his decision already made. "There's a way," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The midnight freight, the timber ghost, It carries raw lumber to the Portland mills, a skeleton crew, and it doesn't stop at the main depot. It slows at the old spur line 2 miles south of town to pick up water. It's dark there. No station, no lights. It was a desperate plan, a sliver of a chance. Riding a rough, jolting freight train was dangerous for any man, let alone a woman in Eleanor's condition. Liam looked at her, his eyes asking the question he wouldn't voice. Her answer was in the steady, determined set of her jaw. "For Arthur," she said quietly, "and for the men in that notebook." Liam gave a curt nod. The plan was set. Their only path to justice was a ghost train, riding on the very tracks owned by the man they sought to destroy. The night of the escape was as black and still as the inside of a tomb. In the main barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and tension. Liam, Eleanor, and Marcus were making their final preparations, their movements swift and silent in the dim lantern light. They were minutes from leaving, from making the desperate run to the rail spur. The plan was set. The risk was absolute. It was in this final, fragile moment of quiet that the barn door was thrown open. A figure stumbled into the light and collapsed onto the dirt floor. It was Leo, Marcus's son. His face was a swollen, bruised mess. His shirt was torn, and he was gasping for air like a landed fish. Marcus rushed to his side, his face instantly a mask of horror and grief. "They took me," Leo choked out, clutching his father's arm. "Blackwood's men. They knew I worked for you." He looked at Liam, his eyes wild with terror and shame. "They wanted to know how you were getting her out." Pa. He wouldn't talk. Marcus bowed his head. A broken man. They started on the boy, Liam," he whispered. "I couldn't. I had to give them something." Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her. It was over. The plan was compromised. "I told them," Marcus confessed, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I told them about the midnight freight. But I swear on my life, I told them the wrong time. I said the 3 a.m. train to give you a window." "It didn't matter," Leo gasped, struggling to sit up. "Blackwood, he's smarter than that. He knew Pa was lying. He laughed about it." The boy's next words fell like a death sentence into the silence of the barn. "It's a trap. He's got a dozen men waiting at the spur line, and he's got every single freight train leaving the valley tonight watched. He knows you're coming." The hope that had sustained them vanished in an instant, replaced by the stark, final reality of their cage. The escape route was an ambush. Marcus's desperate gamble to save his son had doomed them all. Liam stood motionless, his face unreadable, the weight of their lives resting on a decision that had to be made in the next few seconds, with the whistle of the approaching midnight train already a faint cry in the distance. The distant train whistle was a death knell. In the tense silence of the barn, Liam's mind, accustomed to calculating the fall of giant trees, processed the new, catastrophic variables. He looked from Leo's terrified, honest eyes to Marcus's broken form, and then to Eleanor, who watched him with a trust that was both a burden and a blessing. He made his choice. "The freight train is the trap," he said, his voice cutting through the panic. He turned to Marcus. "What else is on that track tonight?" Hope flickered in the foreman's eyes as his mind, sharp and desperate, found a new path. "The Mail Express," he said quickly. "For Portland. It doesn't stop, but it slows for the sharp curve at the old trestle, a mile before the spur, 10 minutes ahead of the freight." It wasn't a plan. It was a prayer. Liam didn't waste a second. "Get in the truck," he commanded. They scrambled into his Ford, its engine roaring to life, and tore down the muddy logging roads, racing the ghost of a chance. They reached the trestle just as the rhythmic clack-clack of the approaching train echoed through the ravine. Its single headlight cut a path through the darkness. It was moving faster than Marcus had guessed. "This is it," Liam yelled over the engine. He brought the truck alongside the tracks, matching the train's speed. He kicked his door open. "Marcus, keep us steady." He climbed out onto the running board, the wind tearing at him. "Eleanor, your turn." He reached into the cab, his arm a steel cable, and pulled her out, shielding her with his body. The open door of a mail car was their target. Liam leaped first, landing with a heavy thud, then turned and caught her, hauling her into the dark, swaying car, just as the truck veered away from the tracks. For a moment, hidden amongst sacks of mail, they thought they had made it. The ambush was behind them. But then a new sound joined the rhythm of the rails, a second, faster beat, accompanied by a furious, high-pitched whistle. Liam peered through the slats of the door. A lone locomotive, stripped down for speed, was closing the distance on a parallel service track. It was Blackwood's personal engine, a black wolf, chasing them down. As it pulled alongside, men began to leap across the perilous gap, landing like cats on the roof of their car. A brutal fight erupted under the cold moonlight, the shouts of men lost in the roar of the two trains. Liam climbed the ladder to the roof, a giant rising to meet the threat, silhouetted against the blur of the racing forest below. The fight on the roof of the racing train was a brutal, windswept battle. Liam, using his size and raw strength, fought with the fury of a cornered bear, sending Blackwood's last man tumbling into the darkness. But the victory was short-lived. A sudden, violent jolt threw him against the car as the train's brakes screeched, the sound of metal torturing metal. The train was forced onto a siding, grinding to a halt beside a derelict, moonlit water tower. The chase was over. The trap was sprung. Silas Blackwood himself stepped from the shadows, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. He was flanked by a half-dozen more men, rifles raised. "This is the end of the line, O'Connell," Blackwood called out, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Give me the woman and the evidence, and I might let your men live." A deafening volley of gunfire answered him, splintering the wood of the mail car where Liam and Eleanor were now pinned down. Just as despair began to set in, the roar of a familiar engine cut through the night. Liam's truck careened down a service road, Marcus at the wheel, two of his best loggers in the back, their hunting rifles already blazing. The fight exploded into chaos. In the flickering light of the gunshots, Eleanor saw one of Blackwood's men take a steady, deliberate aim at Liam from behind the cover of the locomotive's wheels. There was no time to shout a warning. Her eyes darted around the dark mail car, landing on a heavy wrench in a broken emergency toolkit. Scrambling outside, keeping low, she saw what the gunman couldn't. A thick, high-pressure steam pipe running along the engine. With strength born of sheer desperation, she slammed the wrench against the main valve. It wouldn't turn. She hit it again and again, putting the full weight of her body and her unborn child's future into the blow. The valve fractured. A deafening roar erupted as a scalding, blinding cloud of steam instantly engulfed the side of the train. The gunman screamed as the vapor hit him, his shot going wild. The sudden whiteout threw Blackwood's men into confusion, and it was all the opening Liam needed. He charged through the swirling mist, a vengeful giant, tackling Silas Blackwood and sending them both tumbling to the ground. The gunfight dissolved into a raw, personal brawl. Liam, fueled by a decade of grief and a night of rage, overpowered his rival. He had Blackwood on the ground, his large hands closing around the man's throat. For a heartbeat, he saw Sarah and Lily in the fire. He saw Arthur Vance's kind face, and every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance. But then he saw Eleanor, safe, her hand resting on her belly, and he knew he was fighting for a future, not a past. He released his grip, hauling a gasping, defeated Blackwood to his feet, just as the wail of sirens signaled the arrival of the state police Marcus had summoned. Justice, not blood, was the prize. A year later, a different kind of dawn broke over the valley. The sun rose on new homes, on a bustling sawmill where men worked with pride, not fear, and on a community that was slowly healing. The scandal, once exposed, had been like a cleansing fire. With the evidence from Arthur's notebook and the testimony of men who were finally free to speak, Silas Blackwood's empire of greed had crumbled. He and his men were now serving life sentences in a federal prison. The valley, in an act of communal rebirth, had even been officially renamed. It was now called Justice Valley. On a hill overlooking the O'Connell ranch, Liam stood with Eleanor, his arm around her shoulders. In a sling against her chest, their 6-month-old son, David, slept peacefully, his small face turned toward the warmth of the morning sun. The air was clean, filled with the scent of fresh-cut lumber and the promise of a peaceful future. "Arthur would have liked this," Eleanor said softly, her gaze sweeping over the thriving land below. "He believed a place could be defined by the goodness of its people." "He was right," Liam said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Liam looked down at her, at the strength and grace that had brought light back into his empty world. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily were still with him, but they were peaceful now, gentle memories, no longer fiery tormentors. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. "I know it's not right to offer a woman a memory," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "But this was Sarah's. She made this house a home. She filled it with love." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant gold ring. "She would have wanted this house to be filled with love again. She would have wanted you, Eleanor, not to replace what was lost, but to build something new upon it." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were tears of profound, heart-aching joy. She looked at the strong, good man beside her, the giant who had sheltered her from the storm and then taught her how to stand in the sun again. She looked at the beautiful baby they had created, a symbol of a love that had bloomed in the very shadow of death. He wasn't offering her a memory. He was offering her a future, a home, a family. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all the hope and love in her heart. "Yes, Liam." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it felt like it had always belonged there. Together they stood on the hill, a new family watching a new day dawn on a valley of justice, their future stretching before them as wide and as promising as the endless Oregon sky.